She was the pack's discarded garbage, a rejected omega left to rot in the winter cold. For 5 years, she poured her broken heart into healing a nameless, mute stable boy. She never suspected the quiet, scarred servant, sleeping in the hay, was the continent's most lethal missing alpha king. Historical records from the lycanthrope clans rarely bother to mention the omegas. They are the footnotes of wolf society, meant to serve, to submit, and to suffer quietly. But if you read the private journals of Lord Hastings, penned in the winter of 1422, you will uncover a hidden, brutal scandal that nearly tore the Northern Territories apart. It wasn't a tale of political espionage or a border war. It was the story of Juliet. Juliet was an omega in the Ashen Peak Pack, a territory known for its merciless winters and even more merciless rulers. Born frail and unable to shift into a full wolf form by her 18th birthday, she was pushed to the absolute bottom of the pack's hierarchy. She scrubbed the stone floors of the pack house until her knuckles bled, ate the scraps left behind by the enforcers, and kept her eyes glued to the dirt whenever a higher-ranking wolf walked by. But fate, in its twisted sense of humor, decided to play a cruel trick on her. It happened on the night of the winter solstice, the most sacred gathering of the year. The pack was celebrating the ascension of their new alpha, Matthew. Matthew was a massive, ruthless man who had taken control of Ashen Peak after a mysterious rogue attack wiped out the previous leadership. He was vain, cruel, and obsessed with pure bloodlines. As the ceremonial fires roared, Juliet was tasked with serving the spiced wine. When she approached Matthew's table, her foot caught on an uneven cobblestone. She stumbled, splashing a few drops of hot wine onto his boots. But before Matthew could strike her, a sudden, blinding scent hit them both. It was the scent of pine, winter frost, and wildflowers. The undeniable, soul-crushing gravity of the mate bond slammed into them, vibrating through the silent courtyard. The moon goddess had paired the most powerful alpha in the region with the weakest omega. The silence that followed was suffocating. Juliet looked up, a tiny, foolish flicker of hope igniting in her chest. For a fraction of a second, she thought her life of misery was over. She thought she was finally going to be loved. Matthew's handsome face twisted into a mask of pure revulsion. He didn't just look angry, he looked humiliated. He grabbed Juliet by the throat, dragging her to the center of the courtyard in front of 300 pack members. "Look at this," Matthew spat, throwing her into the snow. "The goddess has lost her mind if she thinks I will tether my bloodline to a defective, weak wretch who cannot even shift. I am an alpha. I need a Luna, not a maid." Tears streamed down Juliet's face, freezing against her cheeks as she gasped for air. "I, Matthew of Ashen Peak," his voice boomed, echoing off the mountains, "reject you, Juliet, as my mate and my Luna. You are a stain on this pack. I strip you of your quarters and your rations. You will live in the outer ruins, and if I ever see your face inside the main walls again, I will have you executed." The rejection severed the bond violently. It felt as though a hot iron had been driven through Juliet's chest. She screamed, clutching her heart as the pack laughed and jeered. She was dragged away by the guards, thrown out into the freezing night, and left for dead near the dilapidated, abandoned stables on the very edge of the territory. For days, Juliet hovered on the brink of death. The pain of a rejected mate bond is usually fatal for an omega. But Juliet had spent her entire life surviving. She refused to die in the snow. Dragging herself into the rotting wooden structure of the old stables, she tried to find warmth in the hay. That was when she smelled it. Blood. Old infected blood, mixed with the sharp tang of silver. Huddled in the darkest corner of the stables was a young man. He was barely conscious, chained to a structural post by heavy iron cuffs. His back was a canvas of horrific, raised scars, burns that looked like they had been inflicted by melted silver. He was filthy, emaciated, and trembling violently. This was the stable boy. The pack simply called him the Mute. Thomas, the cruel stable master, had bought him from a caravan of human slavers years ago. Whenever a horse misbehaved, or whenever Thomas was just in a foul mood, he took his whip to the boy. Juliet crept closer. The boy's head snapped up. His hair was long, matted with dirt and dried blood, hiding most of his face. But his eyes, they caught Juliet off guard. They were a piercing, vibrant amber. They weren't the eyes of a broken slave. They were the eyes of a predator locked in a cage, analyzing her every breath. "It's okay," Juliet whispered, her voice raspy from her own trauma. She held up her empty, trembling hands. "I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't speak. He couldn't. Juliet would later learn that his throat carried a thick, jagged scar, as if someone had forced him to swallow wolfsbane lye to permanently destroy his vocal cords. Despite her own agonizing heartbreak, Juliet's nurturing instincts kicked in. She tore a piece of her ruined dress, gathered snow to melt into water, and slowly, gently, began to clean his wounds. The boy flinched, his muscles tensing like coiled steel, but he allowed her to touch him. "I'm Juliet," she whispered in the dark, wrapping his battered shoulders. "I don't know your name, but I think I'll call you Ro." The boy, Ro, stared at her. For the first time in his brutalized life, someone had touched him with something other than a whip or a blade. In the freezing ruins of the Outer Rim, a rejected Omega and a mute, broken slave formed a silent pact of survival. 4 years passed. To the rest of the Ashen Peak pack, Juliet was a ghost, a cautionary tale. But out in the ruins of the old stables, she had built a life. A hard life, but a peaceful one. She and Ro became inseparable. Juliet would sneak into the nearby woods to forage for medicinal herbs, trading them secretly with Abigail, an older cook from the pack-house kitchen, in exchange for stale bread, tough meat, and cast-off blankets. Juliet used those resources to keep herself and Ro alive. Under Juliet's care, Ro had transformed. He was no longer the emaciated boy trembling in the hay. He had grown into a towering, heavily muscled man. Standing well over 6 feet tall, his physique was carved from years of silent, agonizing labor in the stables. His hair, now washed and cut by Juliet, fell in dark, thick waves around a sharp, aristocratic jawline. If it weren't for the rugged dirt on his skin and the horrific scars hidden beneath his tunic, he would have looked like a high-born lord. But it was his demeanor that fascinated Juliet the most. Wolves are creatures of hierarchy. Body language dictates everything. An Omega like Juliet naturally slouched, keeping her neck exposed in submission. Ro, however, moved with an eerie, lethal grace. When he stood perfectly straight. When he looked at the enforcers who came to check the stables, he didn't lower his eyes in fear. He lowered them with a cold, terrifying calculation. He never spoke a word, but he listened to everything Juliet said. In the evenings, huddled by their small fire, she would talk to him. She told him about her dreams of leaving the Northern Territories, of seeing the ocean, of living in a place where omegas weren't treated like cattle. Ro would sit beside her, whittling small wooden figures with a stolen dagger, his amber eyes softening only for her. Sometimes, when the night was exceptionally cold, he would pull her against his massive chest, wrapping his body around hers, radiating a heat that felt unnatural, even for a werewolf. The delicate peace they had built was shattered in the late autumn of 1426. Matthew's rule over Ashen Peak had grown tyrannical. He had been heavily taxing the outer villages and conscripting young wolves into a private army. Rumors were swirling that Matthew was preparing to make a play for the High Council, the supreme ruling body of all lycanthrope clans. 10 years ago, the true Alpha King of the continent, Aldrich of the ancient royal bloodline, was supposedly assassinated along with his entire family in a violent coup. Since then, the kingdom had been fractured, ruled by a council of squabbling alphas. Matthew wanted to be the one to claim the empty high seat. Because of this militarization, more guards were stationed near the outer rim. One evening, Juliet was returning from the kitchens with a basket of stolen scraps when she was cornered behind the stables by Garrett. Garrett was one of Matthew's top enforcers, a massive, cruel brute who enjoyed tormenting the weaker pack members. He was heavily intoxicated, his breath reeking of cheap ale as he pinned Juliet against the rough stone wall. "Look what we have here," Garrett slurred, grabbing her jaw. "The Alpha's little discarded toy. It's a shame you're stuck out here, Juliet. You've actually grown quite pretty. Let's see if you're as useless as Matthew says." Juliet panicked. She kicked, scratching at his face, but Garrett merely laughed, slapping her hard across the cheek. The force sent her crashing into the dirt, her lip splitting open. Before Garrett could step toward her, the air in the courtyard seemed to drop 10 degrees. The heavy wooden doors of the stable didn't just open, they were violently ripped off their iron hinges. Out stepped Ro. I didn't hold a weapon. He didn't roar. He merely walked out into the moonlight, his amber eyes glowing with a terrifying, unnatural luminescence. The sheer, suffocating weight of his aura slammed into the courtyard. It was so heavy, so oppressive, that Juliet physically gasped for air, clutching her chest. Garrett froze. The drunken smirk melted off the enforcer's face. He was an elite warrior, a high-ranking Delta, but as Ro took a slow, deliberate step toward him, Garrett's knees visibly buckled. Every instinct in Garrett's wolf DNA was screaming at him to drop to the ground and bare his throat. The pressure radiating from the mute stable boy was astronomical. It wasn't just the aura of an alpha. It was the aura of an apex predator, an ancient royal dominance that commanded the blood in their veins. Ro reached Garrett in 3 strides. He didn't throw a punch. He simply grabbed the massive enforcer by the front of his armor and lifted him entirely off the ground with one hand. Garrett choked, his eyes wide with absolute, paralyzing terror. He tried to speak, tried to beg, but Ro's grip tightened, cutting off his air. For a second, Juliet saw pure, unadulterated murder in Ro's eyes. "Ro, stop!" Juliet cried out, scrambling to her feet. "If you kill him, they'll hang you. Please!" Ro's ear twitched. Slowly, the murderous glow in his eyes faded back to normal. The crushing aura in the air vanished instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. He unceremoniously dropped Garrett into the mud. Garrett scrambled backward on his hands and knees, coughing violently, not daring to look Roe in the eye. He turned and ran toward the main keep, terrified, convincing his drunken mind that he had merely been startled by a shadow. Roe turned to Juliet. He gently reached out, his massive, calloused thumb wiping the blood from her split lip. His eyes were filled with a desperate, silent apology. Juliet stared at him, her heart pounding furiously. "Who are you?" she thought. "What are you?" No human, and certainly no ordinary wolf, could exert that kind of spiritual pressure. But there was no time to ask questions. The next morning, a deafening horn echoed through the valley. It wasn't the pack horn. It was the deep, resonant bellow of the royal emissary's brass horn. 3 heavily armored carriages, bearing the silver and obsidian crest of the High Council, had arrived at the gates of Ashen Peak. Word spread through the servants quickly. The emissaries were traveling across the continent with a sacred relic, the obsidian fang. It was an ancient stone that glowed only in the presence of the true royal bloodline. The council had received a prophecy from the seers that the assassination 10 years ago had failed. The true heir, Aldrich, was still alive, hidden somewhere in the territories. Matthew, desperate to prove he was worthy of the crown, had invited the emissaries to Ashen Peak to test his own blood, convinced his strength made him the rightful ruler. He demanded that every single member of the pack, from the highest elite to the lowest servant, be present in the grand hall to witness his ascension. That included the stable slaves. As Thomas the stable master marched a heavily chained row toward the grand hall, and Juliet followed anxiously behind, the stage was set for a reunion that would shake the very foundations of the lycanthrope world. The rejected Omega was about to discover exactly who she had been saving all these years. The great hall of Ashen Peak was a cavernous structure of black stone and vaulted timber, built to intimidate. Tonight it was suffocatingly crowded. Hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the scent of roasted venison, heavy perfumes, and a distinct underlying tension. Banners of deep crimson and charcoal hung from the rafters, framing the elevated dais where Alpha Matthew sat on his carved wooden throne, looking every inch the conqueror he believed himself to be. Near the massive hearth, flanked by heavily armored guards, stood the High Council emissaries. Their leader, Lord Godfrey, was an ancient, scarred veteran of the Lycan Wars. He held a velvet-lined mahogany box with a reverence usually reserved for the gods. Juliet stood at the very back of the hall, shivering in her thin, patched tunic. She was wedged between Thomas, the sneering stablemaster, and Roe. Heavy iron shackles bound Roe's wrists and ankles, clanking softly with his every breath. Thomas had dragged him here to humiliate him, a visual prop of Ashen Peak's dominance over its slaves. Juliet instinctively reached out, her small, calloused fingers wrapping around Roe's chained wrists to offer a silent comfort. Roe looked down at her, his amber eyes calm, unbothered by the chains, focused entirely on keeping her safe in the chaotic crowd. A booming horn silenced the hall. Lord Godfrey stepped forward, his voice carrying effortlessly over the breathless crowd. "For 10 years the throne of the Lycan kingdom has sat empty," Godfrey proclaimed, his stern gaze sweeping the room. The royal bloodline of King Aldrich was thought extinguished in the night of the Red Treason. But the seers have spoken. The blood survives. Tonight we present the obsidian Fong, the sacred heart of the first king. It does not lie. It does not yield. It will only awaken for the true sovereign. Godfrey opened the box. Inside rested a wounded, pitch-black stone. It seemed to absorb light around it, radiating a cold, ancient magic that made the hair on Juliet's arms stand up. Matthew stood up, smoothing his velvet cloak, a smug smile plastered across his handsome face. He walked down the steps of the dais, the crowd parting for him. He was so confident, so blinded by his own arrogance, that he didn't even hesitate. "I have brought order to the north," Matthew declared loudly, ensuring every emissary heard him. "I have built an army. I am the strongest alpha this continent has seen in a century. My blood is worthy." Matthew unsheathed a ceremonial silver dagger and sliced the palm of his hand. He stepped forward and pressed his bleeding hand flat against the obsidian fang. The hall held its collective breath. Juliet watched, her stomach churning, terrified of what would happen if Matthew became the High King. For a second, nothing happened. Then a sharp, violent hissing sound erupted. Smoke poured from beneath Matthew's hand. The obsidian fang didn't just reject him, it burned him. Matthew screamed, ripping his hand back. The flesh of his palm was charred black, sizzling as if he had plunged it into a blacksmith's forge. The stone itself turned a dull, lifeless grey, completely inert. A collective gasp rippled through the pack. Matthew's face contorted in agony and pure, unadulterated fury. "It's a trick," he roared, clutching his ruined hand. "The stone is cursed. You dare bring defective magic into my hall, Godfrey." Godfrey looked at the stone, then at Matthew, his expression turning to stone. "The fang does not lie, Matthew. You are not the king. You are merely an arrogant usurper with delusions of grandeur." Before Matthew could order his guards to attack the emissaries, the room began to vibrate. It started as a low hum, a frequency that rattled the iron chandeliers and made the floorboards tremble. The obsidian Fong, still sitting on its velvet cushion, began to pulse. It shifted from dead grey to a brilliant, blinding sapphire blue. A beam of ethereal light shot upward from the stone, illuminating the dark rafters. Godfrey's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. "The king," he whispered. "He is here. The king is in this room." The stone levitated an inch off the cushion, the sapphire light tilting, acting as a compass. The beam of light sliced through the grand hall, bypassing the elite warriors, the deltas, and the high-born ladies. It pointed directly toward the darkest, most wretched corner of the room. It pointed at the slaves. The crowd parted like Moses splitting the sea, scrambling away from the light. Godfrey, trembling with the mix of fear and awe, walked slowly down the center aisle, following the stone's agonizingly bright glare. Matthew marched right behind him, his eyes wild with rage. The light stopped at the back wall, illuminating two figures, a terrified Omega girl and a massive, filthy, chained stable boy. Matthew let out a barking, hysterical laugh. "A slave? You think a mute, crippled stable boy is the king of the lichens? Your relic is broken, Godfrey. Thomas, execute the boy for making a mockery of this ritual." Thomas, eager to please his furious alpha, drew his broadsword and stepped toward Roe. "With pleasure, Alpha." "No!" Juliet screamed, throwing herself in front of Roe, shielding his massive body with her fragile frame. Don't touch him, please, Thomas sneered, raising the heavy steel blade above his head. Move, Omega Trash, or I'll split you in half, too. As the sword began its descent, the air in the room was suddenly sucked away. It was as if a vacuum had been opened in the center of the hall. The pressure was so immense, so violent, that torches lining the walls instantly snuffed out. Roe didn't just step forward, he moved with the speed of a lightning strike. He reached around Juliet and caught the descending broadsword by the naked blade with his bare hand. Thomas froze, his eyes bulging. Roe's hand didn't bleed. His grip on the steel was absolute. With a sickening crack, Roe twisted his wrist, shattering the heavy broadsword into a dozen jagged pieces. Before Thomas could scream, Roe kicked the stable master in the chest, sending the massive man flying backward 30 feet, crashing through an oak dining table and lying completely still. Then Roe raised his arms, the thick tempered iron cuffs binding his wrists, chains meant to hold enraged, fully shifted wolves, snapped like brittle twigs. The metal rained down onto the stone floor in a shower of heavy clangs. The mute stable boy stood to his full, terrifying height. He pulled Juliet gently behind him, shielding her. And then he let his aura drop. It was a shock wave of spiritual dominance. It didn't demand respect. It crushed defiance into the dirt. Every single wolf in the room, from the lowest servant to the High Council emissaries, was physically driven to their knees. The stone floor cracked beneath the weight of his power. Even Matthew, the tyrannical alpha of Ashen Peak, fell to his hands and knees, choking on his own spit, unable to lift his head against the agonizing gravity of the true royal bloodline. Roe's amber eyes burned like twin suns in the dim hall. The jagged scars on his throat began to glow with a strange silver fire, the ancient wolfsbane poison that had silenced him for a decade, finally burning away under the unleashed inferno of his alpha spirit. For the first time in 10 years, the mute stable boy opened his mouth, and a voice rolled through the grand hall. It was rough, grating, and incredibly deep, echoing with the authority of an ancient god. You have sat in my chair long enough, Matthew. Matthew, trembling uncontrollably, managed to crane his neck upward, blood trickling from his nose under the crushing spiritual pressure. Aldrich, he choked out, staring at the scarred face of the slave he had ignored for years. It cannot be. You were slaughtered with your father. I survived. Aldrich's voice vibrated through the stones, heavy with a decade of suppressed rage. I survived the silver blades. I survived the lie poured down my throat. I survived the chains. And I watched. I watched you turn my father's kingdom into a playground for your vanity. I watched you starve the weak to feed your pride. Lord Godfrey, tears streaming down his weathered face, pressed his forehead to the stone floor. My king, forgive us. We did not know. Rise, Godfrey, Aldrich commanded, and the pressure lifted just enough for the emissary to stand, though the rest of the pack remained pinned to the floor. Aldrich walked slowly down the aisle, his heavy boots echoing in the absolute silence. He stopped in front of Matthew. The tyrannical alpha was still on his knees, panting, eyes wide with the realization that his reign, and likely his life, was over. Are you going to kill me? Matthew spat, trying to salvage a shred of his pride. Do it then. Be the butcher they say your bloodline is. Aldrich stared down at him with an expression of profound disgust. death is a mercy for a man of your arrogance, and it is too quick a punishment for what you did to her." Aldrich didn't need to say her name. Matthew knew exactly who he meant. "I, Aldrich of House Ethelgard, true king of the Lycans, strip you of your alpha command," Aldrich's voice echoed with magical resonance. The royal decree struck Matthew like a physical blow. Matthew screamed in agony as the alpha spark within his soul was forcibly extinguished, ripping his power, his strength, and his wolf spirit away. He slumped to the floor, reduced to a hollow, powerless human. "You are banished to the outer ruins," Aldrich continued coldly. "You will live out your mortal days freezing in the dirt, just as you forced my Omega to do. If any wolf of Ashen Peak offers you a crumb of bread or a blanket, they will answer to me." Guards who had served Matthew only moments before eagerly dragged the weeping, broken man out of the grand hall. Aldrich turned his back on the throne. He ignored the High Council emissaries waiting for his orders. He ignored the hundreds of elites bowing in reverence. Instead, he walked all the way back to the darkest corner of the room, stopping directly in front of Juliet. Juliet was shaking violently. The boy she had bathed, the boy she had fed scraps of stolen bread, the man she had shared a freezing hay bed with for 4 years, was the supreme alpha, the ruler of all packs. She instinctively dropped her gaze, her Omega training overriding her mind, preparing to drop to her knees and submit to the king. Before her knees could touch the floor, Aldrich caught her. His massive, calloused hands, the same hands that had just shattered iron, gently cradled her face, lifting her chin so she was forced to look into his burning amber eyes. The terrifying aura in the room vanished completely, replaced by a wave of pure, overwhelming warmth, safety, and a scent that made Juliet's soul sing. Pine, winter frost, and wildflowers. "Do not ever bow to me, Juliet," Aldrich whispered, his rough voice cracking with emotion. I don't understand," she stammered, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "You're the king. I'm a rejected Omega. I'm nobody." "You are my savior," Aldrich said, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. "When the world threw me into the dark to rot, you were my only light. You didn't see a king. You saw a broken slave, and you gave him your heart anyway." Aldrich took a step back and did the unthinkable. In front of the High Council, in front of the elites who had mocked her, the Alpha King sank to one knee, bowing his head to a nameless Omega. Matthew was a fool, blinded by his own pathetic ego. He rejected you because he was too weak to handle your true destiny, Aldrich declared, his voice rising so every soul in the hall could hear it. The moon goddess did not pair you with him. The goddess hid you here, in the shadows, to save my life. You are not his mate, Juliet. You are mine. The words shattered the air. A true royal mate bond snapped into place, so powerful and blinding that it felt like golden fire rushing through Juliet's veins. The pain of her past rejection vanished instantly. Consumed by a love so profound, it took her breath away. Aldrich stood, taking her small hand in his, and led her down the center aisle. The wolves of Ashen Peak parted, trembling, their heads bowed low. They weren't just bowing in fear of the king. They were bowing in absolute reverence to the Omega they had cast aside. Aldrich led her up the steps of the dais. He didn't sit on the throne. Instead, he pulled Juliet into his arms, kissing her fiercely in front of the entire kingdom. It was a promise of retribution, of healing, and of an era where no one would ever be discarded in the snow again. The rejected Omega had not just saved a stable boy. She had forged a king, and in return, he crowned her his lunar queen, forever silencing the wolves who had once called her weak. The legend of King Aldrich and Queen Juliet echoed through Lycan history forever, proving that true power doesn't roar from a throne, but whispers in the darkest, most broken corners of our lives. If you loved this dramatic tale of a rejected Omega discovering her destiny, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, share this video with your fellow werewolf romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more epic, heart-pounding stories. Let us know in the comments what you want to see next.